The Scale of Empire by Vievee Francis. Yet the most distinctive, and perhaps the most impressive, characteristic of the American scenery is its wilderness. Thomas Cole, founder, Hudson River School.
The wood that engulfs an empire of stone cares only to maintain itself, to green against the decadent progressions, discovery, desperation.
Our delusion? Digging into the earth that submits only temporarily.
Eventually, the vine creeps across the well-swept patio, up the walls, then through under the iron rails.
The overwrought towers bend to the runner's thinnest twine, and eventually stand only in memory as ruins even the rats won't enter.
Cut back the undergrowth.
Seize the molding dead below.
Snip the limbs just at the joint.
The discarded apple will have its revenge in the rotting, feeding the hungry world that cracks the sidewalk, sating the birds that adapt to the landscape of cities as easily as a winged roach that nests in the paneling.
So let us go on. Swatting the locusts that decimate the ordered fields, insisting upon graphs, the architecture of command and sequence.
The ants have already mastered the soil. Small emperors of patience, they walk a bridge of dinosaur bones.
The major theme of The Scale of Empire is that all man-made things are temporary, but nature is permanent. Regardless of how bold and powerful they may be, all human civilizations eventually fade completely from the earth, though nature exists forever, passively adapting and waiting to reclaim what man took from it. Francis includes the quote at the beginning of the poem to first introduce nature as impressive and more unique than civilization itself. This may be difficult for many to accept, as we humans think of nature as full of resources meant for us to exploit. Such thinking is foolish, however, and wrought with arrogance. We are insignificant compared to the power of nature. The reason nature is more powerful than civilization is that nature simply cannot be defeated. When living things in nature are killed, they still help other living things grow. Nature is adaptable and rebuilds itself, but human civilization does not. This shortcoming allows for nature to erase human civilization from the pages of time once it collapses, as it inevitably does. Perhaps in this way, nature is the most powerful empire of all.
The Scale of Empire by Vievee Francis has a similar message to some of the other works of literature that we've discussed in our class. For example, the similarity in ideas between Waterland and this poem is evident. This poem discusses how humans build empires as a method of progression to overcome nature, but in the end, nature prevails after waiting patiently. This is shown in Waterland by how the Fens people drained the land of water and constantly required pumping of water. But eventually, a dam would burst and the land would flood. They tried pushing back the water, but the water kept returning. Despite their most valiant efforts, the empire builders couldn't constantly fight this battle with nature. If the slightest chance arises, nature strikes back, as it did with the flooding of the Fens. Both the poem and the novel show how people develop their empires by cultivating the land and building on the land, but in the end, nature will prevail. Also, this poem has similarities to Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. In Heart of Darkness, the land in Africa is covered by many different empires. The Dutch control some of the land, the natives control parts of the land, and Kurds control a large chunk of the natives and the land further inland. Despite all of these empires, only nature is constant. It's this powerful underlying empire that is overlooked by these men, but is slowly uprooting them. The forest and power of nature continue to survive in Africa long after the Dutch leave, Kurds is destroyed, and the men lose their power in the region.
I placed a jar in Tennessee, and round it was, upon a hill. It made the slovenly wilderness surround that hill. The wilderness rose up to it, and sprawled around, no longer wild. The jar was round upon the ground, and tall, and of a port in air. It took dominion everywhere. The jar was gray and bare. It did not give of burden bush, like nothing else in Tennessee.
The jar, being man-made and placed upon a hill by a person, symbolizes civilization, just as man built civilization in the midst of the wilderness, and round it was upon a hill. The roundness implicates that the jar, and the civilization it symbolizes, stood out from the rest of nature, and the wilderness rose up to it, suggesting the wilderness rose up to fight man at the beginning, but soon it became no longer wild, which suggests that the jar had somehow tamed the wilderness, just as our civilization has tamed the wild lands to our will. The jar stood victorious above nature. It took dominion everywhere. However, the jar is now gray and bare. It did not give of bird or bush. The things that gave it the appearance of life and variety were missing. It has now become weakened as the slovenly wilderness from the beginning of the poem. Something that comes up often in the poem is the notion of the circle. The jar is round, and nature is described as surrounding the jar, suggesting that circularity has much to do with the message of the poem. Indeed, the poem ends in Tennessee, the same place it started at, with the slovenly nature replaced with a gray and bare jar. The message of the poem is that man's attempt to conquer nature is a futile one, as man becomes complacent and dreary without nature, and all's left is gray and bare, leaving only illusions for man to lord over. Waterland. Anecdote of the Jar has a very similar message to Waterland. In the first chapter of the book, the fens were described as having many occupants, a lot of whom have tried to tame the fens to their own advantage. However, as the occupants came and left, the water and the plants kept coming back to the fens, no matter how hard the people tried to civilize the land. In the fens, time passed the inhabitants without a warning, without the slightest sign of change. No, the fens stayed the same as always, suggesting that in similarity with Anecdote of the Jar, civilization's attempts to conquer nature is nigh impossible, since nature doggedly persists to resist civilization, as hinted in the book. Even if man manages to conquer nature, it is a victory only in name, and man itself is weakened without the variety and life that nature provides it, and falls into a lethargy that cripples its imagination and dulls its lives. Heart of Darkness. As the jar succumbs to the malaise of nature, so do the white men suffer from the dangers of the dark continent. The jar's fall from glory is mirrored in the character Kurtz, who was sent by the colonizers to conquer the natives, but he himself, after enthralling the locals, became one of them. Kurtz refuses to leave his new habitat, where the natives treat him as no less than a deity. However, Kurtz's health has reached a critical point from his prolonged stay in Africa, and the death of his ambitions and childhood dreams of grandeur is not so different from the message given in the Anecdote of the Jar, where civilization foolishly attempts to subdue nature, but falls prey to a strange malaise, one of decadence and complacency. Here, in the heart of darkness, Kurtz falls to the harshness of Africa, and the very land that he sought to tame. All man-made things are temporary, but nature is permanent. Anecdote of the Jar shares many similarities with The Scale of Empire. Both imply that nature cannot be defeated by civilization. However, The Scale of Empire suggests that nature waits for civilization to fall to pieces, at which point nature will pick up the broken pieces and re-establish itself in the world. In Anecdote, however, nature is conquered, but man's civilization falls to decadence and complacency by a lack of nature. Both readings suggest the pride and arrogance of men wanting to dominate the world, but in both poems, the antagonists win a hollow victory, as they are doomed to an inevitable decay and collapse. The overlapping message in both poems. Attempts to conquer nature is futile, as man is neither adaptable nor as resilient as the forces of life.